shared your message right up. Just sit.
Well, good morning, folks. Welcome to Sunday Forum as we continue our Lenten journey with Blessed Vulnerabilities. And this week is Blessed are those who suffer, which honestly might be the most challenging of our twist on the Beatitudes. Even those who mourn, I think, is a little less prickly, shall we say, than suffering. But as Paul reflects today in Romans, and as Lori so wonderfully did and will do again in her message, suffering provides, it's not to just put a positive spin on it, but if suffering produces endurance and endurance produces hope, there's this opportunity to learn and to grow from suffering. And in a way, we've kind of taken a tack from that. What kinds of things can we learn from suffering might be a way of looking at this. And I actually wanted to start off with my own story, which is that when I was in seminary, the way the schedule works with your years, you're never at seminary the same year with another class, just 1 year. So you only get to overlap 1 year. And a whole bunch of people kept telling me, there's this person, her name is Sarah, you two would get along so well, you should get to know her when she returns from internship. Well, she didn't. She got cancer and had to take a year off, and actually she had to take, I think, 2 years off. And so it just happened to be because I didn't get a call immediately out of seminary, which was my own personal journey with suffering at the time, that I got to actually meet her, and we become great friends. At the start of that journey, I just kind of like, hey Sarah, a whole bunch of people have said we would make good friends. It's a fun way to introduce yourself to somebody. And I said, I heard you like Indian food. Let me take you out to my favorite Indian place in Colombia. And Sarah's in a wheelchair, a motorized chair, and so we went to this restaurant, we get settled, we start talking, and I said, well, I understand you're just coming out of, in recovery from cancer. How is that? I asked. And she started out, and again, I'm just getting to know her, so this was the first time sort of learning about her and her history. She said, well, I never thought that I would get cancer a second time before I turned 30. And that is when I realized I was on a journey with her. And she told me this story. She said, when I was 5, I got cancer for the first time. And a doctor or a nurse, some medical professional, gave her the wrong dose of chemotherapy, and is what resulted in her being paralyzed from the waist down. And she didn't carry resentment or anger about that, maybe a little bit of frustration, but she said, I don't remember walking all that much, I was pretty young when it happened, so to me, heaven isn't the place where I regain my ability to walk. She said, heaven is the place where all the paths are paved. Because what she suffers with is not that she's limited by the chair, she's limited by the society where there aren't ramps every place, where every place isn't handicap accessible. So her idea of the kingdom of God is where everything is handicap accessible. And it gave me a shift on perspective, because I think I had imagined heaven or the reign of God as the place where all suffering was ended, as Revelation says. But the nature of the ending of suffering might be unexpected. And I really learned and grown from my relationship with Sarah. There's a picture of her and another friend, and they're napping in the library during finals week. And I look up and I glance at my sister in Christ on occasion and think, and she reminds me about what she taught me about suffering and about a lot of other things in life. Thank you all to our panelists. Each of you have a different sort of perspective, twist maybe you might say, on suffering. And I just wanted to start with you.
Oh.
Yeah. Dennis, thank you for being here.
Sure.
Yeah.
My name is Dennis Anderson, and I've been a parish pastor, but now I'm retired and do some other things related to that. I'm also done a lot of chaplaincy and that's been hospital ministry, but primarily hospice chaplain. And so been involved with Hospice of Spokane for about 15 years now, and still doing some volunteering with that too. So lots of listening, lots of learning through that chaplaincy process. Then of course, being a human being, I have my own forms of suffering and all that goes. So when thinking about what to say, it's like, boy, there's a lot one can talk about. But I think there's kind of a direction of what can we learn, how can we grow from suffering. For whatever reason, the story that came to mind for me was in the year 2000 when my grandmother died. This is my dad's mom. She had been in a care facility in Oregon, and my dad would make trips, and sometimes I with him, to visit my grandma, Elsie. This time I was coming from, I guess, Montana, was living at the time, we were living at the time. And she had dementia just before, and then she died, and it was a peaceful death. But when it came time to decide on having a service, she didn't really attend a church. And so somehow or another it came that, I don't know if I offered or I was asked to do the service and in that facility. And I had just enough wherewithal to know that maybe it would be of help to the folks in the facility, some of the other residents there. I know it would be a help to me to hear some of what the residents had to say about their memories of Grandma in their later years. So I did the service, and my little group of family went, and we had a really nice service, and there was sharing, sure enough, by the residents that came out and were a part of that. The part that surprised me was after the service, when some came up to me and said, "Thank you for doing this service. We've never had one here before, and here people just disappear from their rooms, and we never hear what happened to them. We don't know if they moved away or they died." And I was surprised, but now in retrospect, not surprised that might happen. And so they talked about the importance of knowing that they won't be forgotten and remembered, they will be remembered. And so that stayed with me, and when it came to Hospice of Spokane, already in place, I didn't create this, there's a ceremony called Light and Life, which is done every, I don't know what day of the week they do it now, but at least it was on Tuesday mornings. We would gather and talk about the clients who had died over the course of the week. Some in our hospice houses, some in their homes, and always a chance to honor the people that we have served and to hear what was important to us in serving them, what we learned from them. And that was also done at our hospice houses as well, as a way also of just a reminder, a gentle kick that not only are we doing work, but these people are sacred, and reminding us that it's important to pause and honor the sacredness of each person, some of whom we would not remember, but others we would remember, but always as a part of that ceremony was the ringing of well, it's a singing bell, but sometimes we used a gong did. And so no matter who the person was, whether there were many words spoken in memory of that person in that ceremony or not, everyone, when their name was read, would have the bell rung, the gong rung. And so everyone was of equal value, if you will. And that sharing of the saying of the names was done by the staff and attendants. So that's just one little thing that reminds me of grief, how healing something, a ceremony like that can be for us, that we need that. The importance of knowing, of wondering, am I seen, am I heard, am I remembered, will I be, and the sacredness of every human life when it comes through that. So that's just sort of scratching the surface. Here's just some aspects from a very personal story with my grandma. And I learned a lot about Grandma that day too, things they shared. So,
You know, one thing I'm mindful of is that we all in this room are born, we all die. We all walk that journey. The physical stuff of our body is designed for life. It is designed to live. And yet our bodies break, we are frail, we suffer. And if we all were like, yes, we all die, that's fine, but it's the suffering in the in-between. And then there's also the release of suffering and an end, and peace and hope. I know a lot of people who take comfort in grieving someone they have lost and saying, well, they're not suffering anymore. But in between that, there can be a lot of suffering there. Sometimes willingly and sometimes not so willingly. Not that, again, not to romanticize suffering, not to put a glossy coat over it, but I imagine you've seen people address and approach suffering and have different responses to suffering at the last, in those last moments. So, I don't know, thoughts, wisdom, insight?
Yeah, one of the myths I think I had, but I think it's a common one, is that we have all the time in the world.
Yeah.
And when you realize that there's a diagnosis, and in our state for hospice care, it's a 6-month diagnosis or less, which might change if the person gets better, etc. But when you realize that death is going to come sooner than later, there's opportunity to look at what's important to me, what's not important to me. Because suddenly now time is short, which can be any moment, of course, but then there's a time to reorient and say, what and who are important to me? And I learned a lot from that too. I mean, I learned much from people who are dying about what's important and not. So some of it involves that. The categories I would always think of in chaplaincy, because the people are all over the map, and we try to meet where they are. Some people are religious, some not. Sometimes the religion serves them. Sometimes, from my perspective, it does not serve them, but it creates a lot of fear and such. But to help identify what is meaningful in that person's life, what does hope look like? Initially, hope might be, maybe I'll get out of this, maybe I'll get better. And you don't want to rob that hope from anybody, because we really don't know. Some people get better and get discharged. So what does hope look like? Which can change. Another one is connection, being connected with who and what is important to me. And that might be the God piece. It might be to creation. It might be, I'd really come to learn the importance of pets. I mean, I thought it was just me, a Dennis thing. I have 2 cats that are icons of God to me. Except maybe when I'm changing their sandbox.
Certainly think that.
Don't tell them they're not. But in people's lives, I think that suffering is hard enough. Suffering alone is harder. And I'm amazed by the role of pets in that losing a pet or the anticipation of it, making sure that pet is cared for, is just incredible. And so that's something I think about a lot there too. But, so I think of spiritual pain does apply to everybody in those categories of meaning. I'm not telling somebody what's meaningful, but rather they're telling me, or we're discovering together through questioning, what is meaningful in your life or not meaningful. What does hope look like? Who or what connection is important? There's a time to get connected with that family member that you talked to for a while, or a friend, or enemy that I need to reconcile with. And then forgiveness too. Sometimes either knowing we're forgiven or the need to forgive. It's something that can be very rich and part of the work of the before death part. So those are some thoughts.
Dave?
Little Mr. Suggestion again here this week, but if you have not watched Sue Lupert's video that Ira created and talking about exactly what Dennis was talking about, when you know time is short, her message about her daughter is really moving.
I would also suggest Shirley Hanson's video is so interesting. She had polio and was in an iron lung, and she had a nurse who cared for her both physically and spiritually. She said, I'm praying for you, and I believe God is going to lead you out of this. And it's what inspired Shirley to become a nurse, to be a caretaker, so she could help other people. So, yes?
I don't want to, I mean, I do want to hear everybody else, but I do think that your point about how religion can create suffering is one that I have butted up against in my pastoral care and found myself having to become curious, to go back to our theme from last week, because the theology that was coming out of the mouth of the person who was dying of cancer was not Lutheran theology. It was what have I done that God is punishing me this way, and so exploring that, but being caught off guard by it. That is real suffering. I mean, it may be worse than the cancer itself, right? Because it has longer repercussions if you think that you are at odds with God.
Yeah, there's an assumption often made that because we're Christians, we get through death easy, and if you're not Christian, I don't know how they do it, but there are some people they get by pretty well, thank you. And it's because for some people don't believe in life after death even, but what looks like a good finish, if you will, is dotting my I's, crossing my T's, and having the time perhaps to do some of that. And then when the time comes, they're often peaceful. And then I might have a person of faith who, again, at the last breath might even be still anxious, though we try to help make that not happen. Absolutely right, though, what you said.
Thank you. Janet, you have a slightly different approach to the question of suffering for us to explore together today. Thank you for being here.
I'm Janet Farnes, and I said I need kind of a prompt because my call really is to creation, justice, and stewardship, and suffering certainly has been a motivator for me. And so the prompt that Edwin provided was, in what ways do you see the suffering of creation impact human lives? And how does the witness of that suffering lead humans to action and change? And so many stories, I wrote things, otherwise you would be here for like 10 years. So I wrote things down so that we will be here only a few minutes. But I hope this kind of reveals a little bit about my story in too. I looked at the seagull. It had a plastic ring, a part of a six-pack lid pack around its neck. It looked like it was starving, it was suffering, and would die a pointless and painful death. It would decompose, and then the six-pack plastic ring would never die or decompose, but would be liberated to strangle another bird or be swallowed into a whale's gullet, or would add to the great Pacific garbage patch, an area twice the size of Texas at 620,000 square miles. When we see an animal suffering, what do? Did I think, I'm not going to dispose of my six-pack plastic ring in the same way. I'm going to cut it up before dumping it in the trash. Or maybe I should not be buying a product with such irresponsible packaging in the first place. How much pleasure I receive from the beverage now needs to be balanced with the potential suffering it can cause. Flash forward a few decades, well, a lot of decades. When I moved to the Spokane area about 5 years ago, I imagined I'd fish for my dinner out of the Spokane River, right behind our house. Then I learned that the Idaho Silver Mines, Kaiser Aluminum, and other industrial companies, they polluted the streams, the lake, the tributaries to the Spokane River. The fish are challenged to survive, are not safe to eat, the salmon are no more. When we see a river suffering, what do? Over many years, I've taken the pride in washing my car in the driveway. Okay, kind of a Pharisee-like, look how clean and like awesome I am. And then I learned how the oil and grease from my driveway car washing process goes into the stormwater drains, and those drains with untreated runoff go directly into the waterways and pollute our streams and rivers. I guess I can make a small sacrifice by being a more responsible car washer and going to a car wash that has an EPA-approved used water disposal system. I feel safer when lights are on all around my house. Then I learned that nighttime lighting is a problem for migrating birds, who often migrate at night. They try to use their natural navigation strategies, but with all the light pollution, they get bad information. Birds can't see the stars or other landmarks, and they might be using, so the birds end up in the wrong place at the wrong time for their food supply and for their efforts at breeding. I guess I don't need all those lights on. Or maybe I can adjust them so they just look downward and allow our beautiful migrating birds a dark night for their migration. I recall Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. No birds, and my heart hurts. Her call to ban the use of DDT showed that we can do better. In my coming-of-age high school years, I periodically watched late news with my dad before we'd say goodnight. Having served in the military as a Navy chaplain during the Korean War, I could tell he was troubled by the scenes of Agent Orange and napalm. Turned out we dropped 1 million tons of napalm each year in Vietnam, and that those products would burn and bomb the vast jungles in hopes of destroying those pesky Viet Cong. Those were human beings, not to mention all the other wildlife. The grotesque theory was, and I have to thank Cardinal Czerny, his amazing lecture this past week at Gonzaga. He said, the theory was drain the pond to catch the fish. It was similar to the kill the buffalo to quell those, the Native Americans' desire to live their traditional ways practice that had been used in a prior century. After the TV showed the fire blasts of napalm, bombs and exploding jungle trees, then they'd show scores of body bags containing US soldiers, casualties of war. Habitat destruction and human life destruction go hand in hand. And the human destruction continues with many of our Vietnam veterans living on the streets, suffering from PTSD and Agent Orange-induced cancers. Veterans returning from Afghanistan and Iraq are joining these suffering ranks from the carcinogenic materials used in the war machine and the trauma of war's human destruction. Just last summer, a heat dome settled on Spokane, and about 20 people died from the heat. These folks were living on the margins without the benefit of air conditioning or resources to keep cool. Folks living in neighborhoods without parks, open spaces, without trees. Folks living in our hot concrete neighborhoods. The Spokesman Review published a connection between heat and lack of tree cover. Will we plant trees? Will we have a response to this? Again, human suffering and habitat destruction, environmental despoiling are part of a family of suffering and bear their story out loud if we're willing to listen. The polluted rivers and lakes, forests decimated by fires and beetles, beetle invasion, the mentally ill, the poor, are part of one picture of the suffering of what Cardinal Czerny called and of course the Pope calls our common home, our planet Earth. We're asked by Jesus to love God and love our neighbor until we see each other at all created things as neighbors. This suffering will continue. Who speaks for the river, the birds, the forest? We must be the voice of suffering for the created world. We must be the ones to respond now and for the benefit of future generations. I love this, future generations of humans and creation. I believe that we save what we love. It's time to fall in love with our created world again, to get out in it and learn what it's teaching us about the suffering of creation. On April 22nd, Earth Day, St. John's Cathedral will be hosting a Hope for Creation Conference that will highlight all our water siblings, headwaters, streams, rivers, lakes, wetlands, as well as all the water caretakers, the Spokane tribe, etc. And all are invited to come and learn and be transformed in love to alleviate the suffering of all creation. Thank you.
You know, I'm mindful of Jesus' own words and hearkening back to Moses' words, which is that, hey, what do you do when you see a donkey stuck in a ditch? You know, even on the Sabbath, you go and lead your animal out of that bind they find themselves in. So even Jesus was mindful of the suffering of creation. The prophets certainly are. One of the challenges I find on this topic is that when we see, and it's just like we see so much suffering, and we see so much suffering in creation. We turn on the news and there's some news story about some wildfire or some thing that is going on. And it is so easy to feel guilty about that and then be paralyzed in our guilt. What do you see the difference between seeing suffering and being paralyzed in our guilt versus being motivated and called to action?
Just the action is the solution. You know, we can be paralyzed. We cannot care. We can turn that off, or we can say, what can I do? And even the smallest move, just not washing my car in the driveway, going to a conference to learn more, being with others who have a heart, taking a walk. If you feel paralyzed, no matter where you are in your life, take a walk, just outside. So I know it's just it seems like a lot of inertia. It's a little bit of inertia, and it will lead you forward.
Well, thank you, Janet. I appreciate that. Donna, you are one of our lay visitors here at St. Mark's, and that means kind of like Pastor Lori and I, and now another team of folks. You are there with people during sometimes not their best moments. You know, I'm mindful you help with Mary Cares, and that usually is very focused on a recent diagnosis or hospitalization, but also visiting with homebound members, oftentimes with chronic conditions that means that they can't go to church, they can't do the kinds of things that they love. So, what is your experience with suffering?
Well, I was going to tell a story of a person that I visit. I have visited them since 2012. They are members of this church. The wife had a stroke, and she is in a care center. When I started visiting with them, she was very responsive, and in fact, when communion was given, she would kind of respond because she knew the words, the communion words, and her husband as well. And so, so they were very responsive to the communion. Over time, she had this stroke, and she kept on saying, all I need to do is learn to walk again, and then I will be home. Well, she has never learned to walk again, and she is in this care center. Now when I visit her, she is usually in bed. She may be awake, she may not be awake. I do give her communion. I wet her lips often for the communion. I don't give her the bread. But her husband is always there. When I first started visiting them, I would often lose them because he would drive her around in a wheelchair, and I didn't know where in the facility they had gone, you know, and he was very responsive to her. Now, he is partially blind, and he can no longer drive. But I have to tell you that I meet them there, I call him, and he is there with her every single day. He takes the bus to go and be with her. And sometimes he goes like this and tries to wake her, and talk with her. And we give communion. And it's very much a couple that love each other and want to be together. And so I find that in the suffering, there is God's presence with them. And so I enjoy visiting them. I enjoy being with them. Sometimes she's awake, sometimes she's not. Okay? But her husband is religiously there every day. And the bus knows him. I mean, where to pick him up and where to drop him off at. So, but it's a very special suffering together and a love together. And I'm glad I can be a part of that and share God's food and drink and sustaining love and peace.
I think you really hit the note for me that really resonates is the presence in suffering, that suffering can be so isolating. And it becomes this sort of cyclical thing, well, what can I do to end my suffering to feel better? Sometimes there's not a clear answer to that, and yet being present with the person in suffering doesn't necessarily help necessarily directly with what's causing it, but it becomes this place of comfort and joy. And I'm mindful that both in that individual, her spouse's presence and your presence there, and bringing the presence of Christ with you in the sacrament, are all different sort of ways and forms that a ministry of presence that responds to suffering, that can provide hope in the midst of suffering. Well, Bob, I approached you a little later in the week. Yes, I did. I approached him later in the week because a few people I first asked to be on the panel said, no, suffering is not my gig. And I jokingly said to Bob, I said, I don't know why, no one wants to talk about suffering. And he very seriously looked at me and said, I do. I want to talk about suffering. So here's your chance, Bob. You get to talk about suffering with a dedicated audience now.
How many of you know what Parkinson's disease is? Okay, here's the big question. How many of you besides me has Parkinson's disease? Anybody?
I know of 3 people in the congregation that have Parkinson's, you included.
I've had it since we moved here from Alaska, roughly, is the best way I can do it. And it started with my hitchhiking finger. And my wife Ruth. You see that? That's how it started. And now it's gotten to the point where the grandkids used to say, and you have to understand I come from a Danish family, so Grandpa is Bestefar.
Yeah.
And Bestemor is,
Yeah.
Bestefar, why do you have horns? Well, it's to help control my Parkinson's disease. Right under here, if you took a scalpel and slit, there's a pulse generator. And there's wires that go around my neck, up over my head, and they terminate here. And it was the 18th of May, 2018. My neurologist is Dr. I need to tell you a story about that pause, I just put it in. I remembered waking up. It's a 2-stage surgery. They put the probes in, come back a week and a half later, they put the pulse generator. So, anyway, I remember the neurologist peeking under the shroud on the operating table. Says, we're gonna hook you up to a pulse generator. It's like a battery charger. I said, great, you're awake during this whole thing. And they plugged me in, and she said, here it comes. And no, it was faster than instantly. The disjointedness, everything that's surrounding my Parkinson's was gone. It was gone. And I'll never forget looking, they had the shroud in the operating room over my head. And all I could see was this much of her. She was smiling. Feels good, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Whoa. Let me go back to this pause here. This is gonna be a little disjointed, because I didn't have a whole lot. The pause that I was telling you a story about something, and yeah, I just did it again. It's like, I liken it to somebody taking all the letter tiles from a Scrabble game and throwing them on the table. And you're supposed to make words out of these that all connect together. Doesn't work that way. So please forgive me if I'm talking with you someplace, somewhere, under a million different circumstances. And I just stop. I'm trying to get my Scrabble tiles organized. Some of the, I'm gonna be real honest here. Where is it Joshua who wrestled with God?
Jacob.
Jacob. I felt like Jacob a lot of times. I don't want to be here. Why are you doing this to me? I used to be able to sing. And it was an enjoyable pastime for me. And it was almost, I woke up one day, and what you hear is, the voice is gone. It is gone, never to come back. And this is after forgive me. This is I have one thought that ran through my mind. I can take a lot of these different things and tell you different, totally unconnected stories. One thing though that resonates in my mind, and I think this is true for all kinds of physical suffering, mental suffering, any kind of suffering. If you should happen into see, I did it again. If you should happen into someone who is willing to give you care in all that that means, take that ball and run with it. I love you, Ruth. That's my character. Sometimes you hear about a healing touch. That's all it takes. No words. How you do? A touch. I kind of keep count of all my disjointedness here. Is there anybody that has any questions about, maybe I should preface that by saying, when Edwin asked me to talk about this, I said, you bet. I need to adjust this side of it. This is going to town on me. You'll find when you do Parkinson's, if it manifests, that controls that hand. And if it really gets bad, you sit on both of them. Yes, ma'am.
I have a beautiful collection of photographs in a book that you compiled because you received a gift from your wife. Can you tell us about that?
Ruth gave me sometimes the memory works really well with Parkinson's. It was in 2006. She gave me a drone that takes pictures, really nice pictures. And so I went out and I thought, I gotta take some pictures of God's creation around Spokane. So I took off from our house out on the Palouse, drive across the road, set my camera up, clickety, clickety, clickety. And so I thought, I gotta share these with somebody. So I found a place online that you could make a book. Anything you wanted. So I made a book. And it was, help me with the title. Oh, sunsets and Psalms on the Palouse, the aerial photography of Robert Schmidt. One time in my life, I did a book.
My book.
I did a book. But it was through Ruth's encouragement that I finished
But-
it. So,
That was a new power tool for you, wasn't it?
it was because I used to do, many of you know I used to do wood turning. And it got to the point where I had enough on the ball that this hobby is gonna be dangerous. I mean, because you got this wood spinning at this tremendous speed and these sharp cutting tools and all that. And I just had to put down. And putting down things that mean a lot to you, that's a tough road to hoe. How many of you have ever heard that expression? Farm kid.
Know that many of us miss your voice,
Oh,
and know that as one parishioner saying, your voice still, especially with "It is well with my soul," you still are in my heart with that song. So thank you. Know that you've blessed many of us with that voice.
I had the opportunity, I was in the Air Force for, at the time, 2 more minutes. I was in the Air Force for 25 years. And I used to sing a lot. I've done the national anthem once, I've done it 4,000 times. Beautiful song, tough song to sing. But I remember going to Disney World. I was stationed in Tampa, Florida. Long convoluted story. I got this gig to the public affairs office at the Air Force Base, and so I showed up to sing the national anthem for their Chamber of Commerce. You understand the Tampa Chamber of Commerce is, probably 2,500 people. I got the job by singing the national anthem at a professional football game. In fact, I even had a football with Joe Montana's autograph.
It's cool.
You ask yourself, why do you remember all this little minutia? I have no clue. I have no clue. It just is sort of there. Anyway, I got a job singing that and I walked out. If you ever had the opportunity to do that, that is the greatest feeling, among other great feelings. But Man. So I plow through life. One thing I would say to bring this full circle for me, even though I wrestle with God about my lot in life, there is always, and I underscore the word, always, somebody on your left, somebody on your right, that's far worse off than you are. Never, ever has that failed me. And I did change, I don't know if I'm the only one that does this or not, but I did change one thing in the liturgy. I changed the hope for the resurrection. I changed that in my mind to the promise. It's a done deal.
Yeah.
Why are we hung up on a promise? A promise from Christ is a done deal. There's everything you wanted to know about Alomi. Don't be surprised if I call you up or post something that says, I started to tell you this story and I love it. Here's the end.
Well, thank you, Bob, and thank you to all of our panelists. We've come to the end of our time, and thank you all for such the breadth and depth of this conversation, the way in which suffering touches on so much, but also the promise of new life and life eternal in Christ that touches it all too. Thank you all.
Thank you.